David Lockhart stepped out of his sleek black car, his gaze fixed on the grand yet decaying mansion before him. The air was thick with the scent of mold and damp wood, and the entire property seemed cloaked in an eerie silence. Moss clung to the stone walls, ivy crept up the cracked windows, and the once grand oak doors now looked worn and neglected. It was hard to believe that he, a successful millionaire with every modern comfort, would ever own such a place. And yet, here he was, drawn to this shadowy relic of his family's past. The attorney, Mr. Collins, a gray-haired, stoic man, adjusted his glasses and handed David a large brass key. "Lockhart Manor has been in your family for generations, Mr. Lockhart," he said, his voice calm yet carrying an undertone of warning. "Your great-uncle, Edward Lockhart, left this property specifically to you." The will was clear. "Why now?" David asked, glancing over at Mr. Collins. "I didn't even know this place existed until last week." Edward was secretive, a reclusive man. He believed in keeping family matters within the family. Mr. Collins hesitated before adding, "He also left a personal note for you, along with some instructions. I was told to deliver it once you settled in." Curiosity piqued, David stepped forward, the key heavy and cold in his hand. The lock resisted at first, but then gave way with a loud, rusty creak, and the grand doors groaned as he pushed them open. The foyer was dark and dusty, the scent of stale air hitting him instantly. Elegant but decrepit, the house hinted at a former splendor with its high ceilings and elaborate, though faded, wallpaper. A massive staircase wound up to the upper floors, its carved wooden banisters wrapped in cobwebs. He shivered as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. "Let's get started, shall we?" The two men wandered through the main rooms, passing through a series of lavish but dilapidated spaces. A grand ballroom with a dusty chandelier, a parlor filled with antique furniture draped in white sheets, and a library with shelves lined with leather-bound books whose titles had long since faded. It felt surreal, as though he had entered a time capsule left untouched for decades. "I'll admit, it's eerie," David remarked, running his fingers along a mantelpiece, feeling the grime beneath his touch. "It's almost as if someone intended it to be forgotten." Collins nodded. "Your great-uncle was said to be rather obsessed with the house's history. He isolated himself here for decades, convinced he was preserving something important. Did he ever explain what that was?" "Only that the answers lie within these walls," Collins replied cryptically. "Your great-uncle made it clear he wished for the family's history to remain, however hidden." As they continued their tour, David noticed something strange. A heavy door at the end of a narrow corridor, reinforced with iron bands and secured with an old, tarnished lock. A small plaque above it read, "The Attic." He turned to Collins. "What's up there?" "Your great-uncle was very particular about that part of the house," Collins said, his tone shifting to one of subtle apprehension. "No one has entered the attic in decades. It's locked from the outside and from within, and he left strict instructions that it should remain so." David's curiosity flared. "And did he ever explain why?" "No, only that it would be for you to decide when the time came." They moved on, leaving the attic door behind, but David couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking, hidden away under the eaves of the old house. After finishing their walk through the lower floors, Collins handed David a sealed envelope. The old paper crackled as David unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note in elegant, looping script. "David, you will find that we Lockharts are bound by more than blood, but by secrets. In the attic lies a truth waiting to be claimed, a part of our family that even time could not erase. When you are ready, go there alone, and do not leave until you understand why it waited for you. E.L." The message left him with an unsettling feeling, but something in the words also stirred a sense of duty within him. He had inherited more than a property. He had inherited a mystery, one that only he could solve. Night had fallen, and David found himself alone in the vast, silent mansion. The feeling of isolation was new to him. He had spent his life surrounded by people, always busy with the demands of his business and social life. But here, surrounded by the weight of his ancestors' secrets, he felt the strange, almost magnetic pull of the attic. He tried to brush it off, telling himself he could explore tomorrow in the daylight. But the shadows seemed to whisper, calling him to the top floor. Resisting a strange sense of foreboding, he climbed the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The attic door loomed at the end of the corridor, its iron bands casting long shadows in the dim glow of his flashlight. He inserted the key, turning it slowly. The lock released with a metallic groan, and he pushed the door open. The air that greeted him was cold, tinged with an odd, earthy smell that reminded him of a cellar. The attic was massive, far larger than he had expected. Boxes and chests were piled against the walls, covered with layers of dust. The floor was strewn with old furniture, portraits with faces obscured by grime, and strange artifacts that seemed to belong to another era. And yet, in the center of the attic was a single, lone item. A wooden chest, smaller than the others and covered with a velvet cloth embroidered with the Lockhart family crest. As he lifted the cloth, the chest felt warm to the touch, an odd sensation in the chilly room. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and opened the lid. Inside, a small, black velvet box lay on top of a stack of faded letters. He opened the box carefully, revealing a gold locket shaped like a heart, its delicate chain gleaming in the dim light. He examined the letters next, gently unfolding one of them, his hands trembling. The elegant handwriting began with a name he did not recognize. "My dearest Isabel." The words that followed revealed a passionate love letter, filled with longing and despair. "I can no longer live with this secret," it read, "but I am bound by forces beyond my control. Perhaps one day, our descendants will know the truth of our love and the curse it brought upon us." David felt a chill sweep over him, and for a moment, he thought he heard a soft whisper, as if someone were standing right behind him, calling his name. He turned, but there was only silence and shadows. His heart raced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. It was then that he noticed something peculiar in the corner of the attic, a glimmering, as if a reflection from a hidden mirror. Moving closer, he found a dusty mirror covered with a sheer cloth. He lifted the cloth and stared at his reflection, but as he did, the mirror revealed not only himself but the faint outline of a woman standing beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. David stumbled back, gasping. But when he looked again, she was gone. Only his pale reflection remained. He left the attic, locking the door behind him, but he couldn't ignore the lingering sense that the mystery of Isabel and his family's hidden past was only beginning to reveal itself. David couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the strange encounter in the attic, the whispers, the woman in the mirror, and that haunting locket inscribed with the name Isabel. There was something about the woman's presence that felt too vivid, too real. By dawn, he had resolved to return to the attic and find out more about this mysterious ancestor and her connection to his family. He pored over the letters in the attic by daylight, each one unveiling a thread of an old love story between his great-uncle Edward and Isabel. The letters were deeply passionate, describing stolen moments, whispered promises, and hidden rendezvous. And yet, despite the obvious affection in Edward's words, David noticed an undercurrent of fear. Edward wrote of a curse that had befallen their love, a force beyond his control that had kept him and Isabel apart. One particular letter caught David's eye. It was dated February 3, 1939, and bore signs of hurried, desperate handwriting. "My beloved Isabel, I fear for your safety as much as my own. There are forces here that will never understand us, never forgive us. I cannot protect you from the sins of my family. Our love is forbidden by a history that binds my soul to this house. If we are discovered, I will lose you forever. I will hide what I can in the attic, so that our story is not erased by time. One day, perhaps, someone will come to finish what I could not. But until then, my love, we are trapped in these shadows. With all my heart, Edward." David sat back, stunned. His great-uncle had hinted at an ancestral curse and the threat of discovery, but the specifics were still maddeningly unclear. As he sifted through the letters, he found a portrait of Isabel tucked into one of the envelopes. She was beautiful, with sharp, haunting eyes and dark hair that tumbled over her shoulders. David felt as if she were staring right at him, pleading with him to uncover the truth she could not speak. As he sat in thought, a creak echoed from somewhere in the mansion. The noise seemed to come from directly below the attic. David hesitated, but curiosity drew him downstairs. He followed the sound to the library, where an old book lay open on a reading stand, despite his not having touched it before. The title read, Lockhart Family Secrets, Legends and Legacy. He skimmed through the pages, which detailed the Lockhart family lineage and strange stories of those who'd lived in the mansion before. According to the book, every generation had its own secrets, but one legend stood out. The story of a tragic romance between Edward Lockhart and a young woman named Isabel, who had supposedly vanished under mysterious circumstances. The townsfolk had rumored that Isabel's spirit lingered in the mansion, trapped by unfulfilled promises and unrequited love. David's thoughts turned to the attic mirror. The woman he'd seen there had resembled Isabel's portrait, with the same intense gaze that felt as though it could pierce the veil between life and death. He shivered, recalling the whisper that had felt as real as his own heartbeat. He felt certain now. There was more to this house, more to his inheritance than mere property. Something in his blood, in the Lockhart name itself, had bound him to this mansion and its secrets. David decided to reach out to the town's historian to learn more about Isabel's disappearance and the supposed curse that had haunted his family. A few hours later, David met with Dr. Eliza Monroe, an elderly historian who had lived in town for over 50 years. She was well-versed in local lore and had dedicated much of her life to researching the Lockhart family. "Ah, the Lockhart mansion," Dr. Monroe said as they sat in her cozy study filled with books and artifacts. "That house is as much a part of this town's history as the Lockhart name itself. But it's been empty for so long that the story of Edward and Isabel has nearly been forgotten." David leaned forward. "Can you tell me what happened between them? And what about the curse I keep reading about?" Dr. Monroe sighed, her eyes narrowing as she thought back to the old legends. Edward Lockhart was deeply in love with Isabel Hawthorne, a young woman from a family of little means. She was beautiful, with a mysterious aura that captivated anyone who met her. But Edward's father, a powerful man with ambitions for the Lockhart family, forbade the relationship. Isabel was seen as unworthy, a mere distraction. David listened intently as she continued. "They say Edward was planning to elope with her, but just before they could run away, Isabel disappeared. Some say she fled to escape the scorn of the Lockhart family, while others believe." Dr. Monroe hesitated, her expression darkening. "Well, the darker rumor is that she was taken by force and imprisoned within the mansion itself." "Imprisoned?" David's voice was barely above a whisper. "By my family?" "Yes. The story goes that Edward's father was so furious that he would rather see Isabel suffer than allow her to taint the family lineage. And soon after her disappearance, people in town reported seeing a woman in white wandering the grounds of the mansion, as if lost or trapped. She fixed her gaze on him. Over the years, people began to believe that Isabel's spirit was bound to the house, forever waiting for Edward to come back to her. David felt a chill race down his spine. Could this ghostly presence be the same woman he had seen in the attic mirror? "What about the curse?" he pressed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Many in town say that every descendant of Edward's line has faced strange misfortunes, particularly in love. Broken engagements, tragic accidents, mysterious disappearances. It's as if the house itself rejects the idea of happiness for the Lockharts." Dr. Monroe leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say Isabel's spirit curses anyone who bears the Lockhart name, binding them to the same fate she suffered." David's mind spun, caught between disbelief and a gnawing sense of dread. If Isabel's curse was real, then perhaps his great-uncle Edward had indeed left him the mansion as a way to make amends, to put Isabel's spirit to rest. As night fell once more, David found himself drawn back to the attic. Climbing the stairs with a flashlight in hand, he felt as if he were walking into another world. The attic seemed darker than before, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. He carefully moved boxes aside, determined to find any clue that could explain Isabel's disappearance and, hopefully, end the curse. As he sifted through an old trunk, David uncovered a small journal, its leather cover cracked with age. It was Edward's, and his last entries were filled with heartache and guilt over Isabel's fate. His final words were barely legible, scrawled in a shaky hand. "I cannot bear it anymore. Her voice haunts me, calling me to free her from this eternal prison. I tried, but I was too weak. For you who comes after me, end this torment. Bring her peace." David's heart pounded as he read Edward's plea. It was clear that his great-uncle had died feeling responsible for Isabel's curse and had entrusted him to set things right. A whisper echoed through the attic, soft yet piercing, as if from right behind him. "David!" He froze, his breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned toward the mirror. This time, the image was clear. Isabel stood behind him, her expression sorrowful yet determined, her eyes boring into his. She mouthed something, her lips forming words he couldn't hear. But then, she lifted her hand and pointed toward the corner of the attic, where an old, heavy wardrobe stood. Heart racing, David approached the wardrobe, his flashlight illuminating the dusty wood. When he opened it, he found only a single item, a faded, torn wedding dress, its lace yellowed with age. Inside the wardrobe door, someone had scratched words into the wood. "Free me." A surge of emotion overwhelmed him, and he stepped back, clutching the flashlight. Isabel's figure in the mirror faded, but her presence lingered, her plea resonating in the silence of the attic. The air around him grew colder, and David knew there would be no rest for her spirit, or the curse, until he uncovered the full truth. He left the attic with a mission now burning in his mind. Isabel wanted to be freed, but to do so, he would have to uncover what had really happened to her. If she was to find peace, and if he was to be free of the Lockhart legacy, the truth needed to come to light, no matter how dark it might be. The following morning, David woke up with a strange sense of urgency. He couldn't shake the image of Isabel's ghostly figure pointing toward the wardrobe in the attic. Her words, "Free me," echoed in his mind, as if she were speaking directly to him from beyond. Isabel wasn't merely haunting the mansion. She was pleading for an end to her suffering. Determined to honor her unfulfilled request, David decided to delve deeper into the mansion's secrets. He spent hours combing through the mansion, room by room, inspecting the walls and floors for anything that might hide clues about Isabel. He knew the Lockhart family was adept at keeping secrets, so there could be hidden rooms, concealed passageways, or other clues tucked away in the decaying structure. In the late afternoon, he found himself back in the attic, standing before the old wardrobe that held her wedding dress. He examined the wardrobe carefully, tapping on its back panel until he heard a hollow sound. Heart pounding, he pushed the wardrobe aside, revealing a narrow door hidden in the wall. He hesitated. If he opened this door, he would be venturing into the heart of the mansion's dark history. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he gripped the rusty doorknob and twisted it, feeling the resistance of years of neglect before it finally gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with mirrors. Each mirror was dusty and cracked, yet their placement felt intentional, as if they were designed to capture the reflections of those who dared to walk down the corridor. The hallway extended far longer than he had imagined, and an eerie silence settled around him, amplifying the faint sounds of his footsteps. As he moved cautiously down the hall, his flashlight revealed strange symbols scrawled on the walls, symbols he vaguely recognized from the journals he had found in the attic. They were the same symbols Edward had referenced, symbols meant to ward off evil, or perhaps to keep something trapped. David realized that he was walking into a space designed to conceal, to contain, and his unease grew with each step. At the end of the corridor was a wooden door with an intricate, carved design that depicted scenes of sorrow, longing, and despair. It seemed to capture Isabel's anguish, as if someone had etched her pain directly into the wood. David pressed his hand against the door and felt a strange warmth, as if it had absorbed years of emotion. Gathering his courage, he pushed it open. Inside was a room unlike anything he'd ever seen. The walls were covered in faded tapestries, each one illustrating a story of unrequited love, betrayal, and loss. An antique piano sat in one corner, its keys dusty but pristine, as though someone had last played it only yesterday. And across the room stood a vanity table, its mirror reflecting a faint light despite the absence of any visible source. David walked over to the vanity, where he noticed a small, leather-bound book resting open on its surface. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was legible. It was Isabel's diary, filled with entries chronicling her time in the mansion. His hands trembled as he read the first entry. February 2nd, 1939. Edward and I are planning to leave tonight. We will be free from this place, free from the chains that have bound us for so long. But I fear his father suspects something. I can feel his eyes watching me, as if he knows our every thought, our every move. David felt a pang of sorrow for Isabel. She had been so close to escaping with Edward, to leaving behind the oppressive confines of the Lockhart mansion. But something, or someone, had stopped her. As he flipped through more pages, her entries grew increasingly desperate, her words scrawled with a frantic urgency. February 8, 1939. They found me. Edward tried to stop them, but they locked me in this room, telling me that I would bring ruin upon the family if I left. I am to stay here until I learn my place. My only solace is knowing that Edward will find a way to free me. He promised me. David read on, feeling as though he were bearing witness to her imprisonment, her gradual descent into despair. In one of the last entries, her handwriting was almost illegible, her words disjointed, as though she were struggling to maintain her sanity. February 15, 1939. He hasn't come. Days have turned to nights, and I can no longer tell them apart. They keep the piano here, taunting me with the music Edward and I would play together. They want me to break, to forget, but I will never forget him. Never. David closed the diary, his heart heavy. Isabel had been locked away in this room, alone and abandoned by those who should have protected her. The weight of her sorrow filled the air, and he felt as though he could almost see her there, sitting at the piano, waiting for a rescue that never came. Suddenly, a soft melody drifted through the room, the sound faint but unmistakable. David turned toward the piano, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't touched it, yet the keys were pressing down, playing the opening notes of a sad, haunting tune. He watched, transfixed, as the melody grew louder, filling the room with an aching beauty. It was the same melody he had read about in the diary, the song Edward and Isabel had shared in happier times. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the music drowned out his thoughts, carrying him to another time, another place. As the final note faded, a soft whisper echoed in his ear. "David!" He turned sharply, searching the shadows, but there was no one there. Yet he could feel her presence, an unspoken plea woven into the silence. She was reaching out to him, desperate to be freed, to finally escape the torment that had bound her spirit to the mansion. Determined, David inspected the room further. There had to be something he was missing, some clue that could help him release Isabel's spirit. His flashlight caught a glint of silver beneath the vanity table, and he bent down, uncovering a small, tarnished key. It was marked with the same family crest he had seen on the chest in the attic. He pocketed the key, feeling a surge of hope. Maybe this was the key to the answers he sought. As he moved to leave the room, he noticed a faint carving in the wall near the door. It was a series of letters etched with care but faded with time. He squinted, tracing the letters with his fingers. They spelled out, "Find the mirror that shows more than your reflection." With the key and the strange message in mind, David returned to the main part of the house, his thoughts racing. A mirror that showed more than a reflection. He remembered the mirrors in the hidden corridor, each one broken or dusty, but perhaps one of them held a clue. He made his way back down the corridor, inspecting each mirror carefully. They were all covered with dust and grime, their surfaces cracked and distorted. But as he neared the last mirror on the wall, he noticed something unusual, a faint, silvery glow that seemed to emanate from beneath the layers of dust. Wiping it clean, he leaned in closer, searching for any hidden message. As he did, his own reflection seemed to shift, revealing the faint outline of a room he hadn't seen before. It was a small chamber, lined with bookshelves and a single, ornate chair. David felt a thrill of discovery. This was it, another hidden room, one that had somehow been concealed within the mirror's reflection. But where was it? He turned back toward the corridor, noticing a thin line in the wall where the dust had settled differently. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the coolness of metal beneath his fingers. With a push, the wall gave way, revealing a narrow passage that led to the chamber he had seen in the mirror. Stepping inside, David felt an uncanny familiarity, as though he were trespassing on a memory that wasn't his own. The room was eerily quiet, filled with the faint scent of old books and lavender, Isabel's favorite flower according to her diary. On the desk sat a single letter, sealed and addressed to the Lockhart heir. He opened it, his fingers trembling as he read the final message left by his great-uncle. To my successor, you, who have come to claim this mansion, must right the wrongs I could not. Isabel was betrayed by our family, locked away in that cursed room by our own blood. I tried to free her, but I was too late. Her soul is bound to this house, her sorrow woven into its walls. Only the one who bears the Lockhart name can release her spirit. The key to her freedom lies in the locket she wore, hidden in the attic chest. When the time comes, return to her room, and she will know you have come to free her. Speak her name, and she will be released from the curse. In what I could not. Bring her peace. David's heart raced as he folded the letter, the weight of his great-uncle's plea heavy on his shoulders. He knew now what he had to do. The locket he had found in the attic wasn't just a relic. It was the key to breaking the curse, to setting Isabel's spirit free. But as he left the hidden room, he felt a sudden, chilling presence. The air around him grew colder, and he heard a faint whisper, as if from a distant memory, calling his name with a voice filled with sorrow and hope. David, come to me. With renewed purpose, he turned toward the attic, ready to face whatever awaited him and determined to end the curse that had haunted his family for generations. As night descended once again on Lockhart Mansion, a heavy silence blanketed the old house. The air was dense with anticipation, as if the very walls were aware of the journey David was about to embark upon. He held the locket in his hand, its weight almost burning against his skin. He could feel the strange energy within it, as if the pendant contained more than gold and memories, as if it held the fragments of Isabel's lost soul. He made his way to Isabel's chamber, the hidden room with the tapestries and piano, steeling himself for whatever he might find. The house seemed to hum around him, the shadows lengthening with each step, and an eerie quiet settling over the rooms as he passed. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of his flashlight, only heightened the tension building in his chest. Upon entering the chamber, he placed the locket on the vanity and spoke aloud, his voice breaking the silence. Isabel, I'm here. I'm here to help you find peace. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in answer, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The air turned icy, and David's breath came out in visible clouds, frosting in the dim light. A soft, sorrowful melody began to play, drifting from the piano corner. The keys moved as though guided by unseen hands, the notes resonating with a haunting, aching beauty. David's heart hammered in his chest, but he steadied himself. Isabel, I know about you and Edward. I know about the curse. I want to help you, but you need to show me how. The melody ceased, and an oppressive silence filled the room. Then, in the mirror of the vanity, her reflection appeared. Isabel, as she must have been in life. Her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes filled with both sorrow and longing. She looked at him, her gaze piercing, as though she could see directly into his soul. David, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakably her. You have come at last. Yes, he answered, his voice wavering slightly. I've come to free you. She watched him, her reflection holding steady in the mirror even as his own wavered. The curse is deeper than a single broken heart, she murmured, her voice filled with centuries of sorrow. The Lockharts took everything from me, my freedom, my love, my future. They bound me here, to this house, to this room. David's throat tightened, guilt and anger flaring within him. How do I break it? How do I free you? Her expression softened, as though she were touched by his sincerity. The locket holds the promise Edward made to me, the promise that we would leave this place together. She reached out toward the locket, her spectral fingers passing through it. Place it around my neck, and I will finally be released. David hesitated, a sudden doubt flickering in his mind. The attic had felt haunted, yet Isabel's presence was nothing but tragic. But if he fulfilled this final wish, would he be risking something more dangerous than he realized? Would he be binding himself to the curse instead? As if sensing his hesitation, Isabel's expression grew pained. "You are the last of Edward's line," she said softly. "If you cannot help me, then I will remain here forever. Locked in this prison, waiting, never finding rest." Her sorrow was palpable, and the weight of her suffering cut through his hesitation. He knew he couldn't leave her like this, bound by the actions of a family that had betrayed her. He stepped forward, lifted the locket, and held it out toward her. As he did, a frigid gust swept through the room, extinguishing his flashlight, leaving him in darkness with only the faint glow from the mirror illuminating her reflection. With trembling hands, David extended the locket toward the mirror. It was as if some invisible force guided him, pulling his hands until the locket touched the glass. The moment it made contact, the room shook, and a sharp, anguished cry filled the air. Shadows seemed to pour from the walls, swirling around him. A dark fog that coalesced into figures, shadowy apparitions with faces twisted in anger and despair. He stumbled back, clutching the locket, as these spirits encircled him. Each figure seemed to whisper words of betrayal, of promises broken, of love twisted into hatred. Among them was a man with Edward's likeness, staring at David with eyes filled with a pain that defied the boundaries of life and death. "You've come to finish it," the apparition hissed, its voice layered with an unholy echo. "But are you willing to pay the price?" David's throat felt dry, his heart pounding with a terror he couldn't ignore. "I'm here to free Isabel," he managed to say, his voice shaky but resolute. "Whatever the price, I will pay it." A silence descended over the room, and then, slowly, the shadowy figures receded, fading into the walls until only Isabel's image remained in the mirror. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, her fingers tracing her heart as if the locket now rested there. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice sounded more like a soft sigh. Her image began to fade, and he felt a strange warmth wash over him, filling the cold void that had settled in his bones. But just as her form vanished, the mirror cracked, splintering outward in a jagged pattern, and he heard a new voice, darker, angrier. "You may have freed her, David, but you are still a Lockhart, and the curse does not end with her release." The warmth he had felt moments before turned to a searing pain, radiating from his chest as though invisible chains were tightening around him. He stumbled back, gasping, as a wave of dizziness overtook him, the room spinning around him. Through the haze, he heard Isabel's voice, faint and distant. "I am free, but you must leave before you become what they made me." With his last ounce of strength, David staggered out of the room, shutting the door behind him. He fell against the wall, clutching his chest as the burning sensation slowly faded. The house seemed to grow quiet, the shadows retreating, but the sense of foreboding remained. The following morning, David awoke on the floor of the hallway, disoriented and aching. He rose slowly, glancing back toward Isabel's room, now dark and silent. He knew that something had changed in the house. The air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted, and yet the words from the night before haunted him. "The curse does not end with her release." He wandered down to the kitchen, where he found an old phone book. He quickly called Dr. Eliza Monroe, the historian who had told him about Isabel and the curse. When she answered, her voice was strained, as if she had been expecting his call. "Dr. Monroe," David said, his voice tense, "I freed Isabel, but there was something else, a warning. The curse doesn't end with her, does it?" The silence on the other end of the line was enough to confirm his fear. "No, David," she replied softly. "The curse is older than Isabel. It is bound to the mansion itself, to every Lockhart who dares to dwell within its walls. Isabel was only one part of the legacy. To end it, you must go even deeper." He ran a hand through his hair, feeling a chill settle over him. "How? How can I end something that has haunted this family for generations?" "There is a way," she said cautiously, "but it is dangerous. You must confront the source of the curse, the spirit of the one who first brought it upon the family, the Lockhart ancestor who invoked it." "Who?" he demanded, desperation seeping into his voice. "Who started all of this?" "Your great-great-grandfather, Theodore Lockhart," she replied. "He was the one who took Isabel and bound her to the house. But he did not act alone. He was aided by an occultist, a man who believed in binding spirits to places of power. He wanted to secure the Lockhart fortune at any cost." David's mind reeled. It was one thing to free Isabel's spirit, but another to face a darker entity, an ancestor who had willingly condemned others for his own gain. Dr. Monroe's voice lowered, as if revealing a final, dreadful secret. "There is an altar hidden beneath the mansion," she continued, "a place Theodore used for his ritual bindings. If you find it, you may find a way to undo the curse." David felt a flicker of determination amidst his fear. "How do I find this altar?" "Return to the attic," she instructed. "The old plans show that there is a trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards. That's where Theodore conducted his rituals, and that's where you must go to end this once and for all." He hung up the phone, feeling the weight of his decision settle upon him. He had released Isabel, but her freedom was only the beginning. Now he would have to face the darkest part of his family's legacy, a confrontation with the very soul of the curse that had plagued the Lockhart line for generations. The attic awaited, as did the truth buried beneath it. With trepidation tempered by purpose, David made his way back to the attic. The morning light did little to ease the shadows that clung to the mansion's walls, and each step felt heavier as he neared the final confrontation with the dark heart of the Lockhart legacy. Dr. Monroe's words echoed in his mind. Theodore Lockhart, aided by an occultist, an altar beneath the mansion. Theodore, his own ancestor, had willingly cursed his family, binding it to Isabel's suffering and chaining his descendants to his dark ambition. The attic door loomed before him, and with a steadying breath, David unlocked it and stepped inside, half expecting the oppressive atmosphere he had felt each time before. But the room had changed. It was quieter, lighter, as though Isabel's release had cleared away some of the shadow that had seeped into its walls. And yet, a deeper secret remained, lurking just beneath the floorboards. He knelt in the center of the attic and began tapping across the floor, listening for a hollow sound that might betray the location of the hidden trapdoor Dr. Monroe had described. At last, a faint thud revealed a square section of the floor that sounded different from the rest. With careful precision, he pried up the wooden boards, revealing a narrow trapdoor bound by iron locks. The rusted hinges creaked as he pulled it open, and a chilling draft swept up from the depths below, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. A staircase descended into the darkness, winding its way deep beneath the mansion. Gripping his flashlight, David took a breath and stepped onto the first step, his pulse pounding in his ears. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with an almost palpable malevolence. The walls around him were rough, lined with ancient stones, and covered in symbols he recognized from the corridor's mirrors: binding sigils, protection runes, wards against evil. Finally, he reached the bottom, where the narrow passage opened into a small chamber lit by a faint, ghostly glow emanating from the walls themselves. In the center of the room stood an altar carved from dark stone, its surface etched with intricate symbols and stained with what he could only guess was blood. Atop the altar sat a single object, a portrait of Theodore Lockhart, his eyes cold and calculating, his expression one of absolute command. David stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the portrait. The figure within seemed to stare back at him, and he felt a growing sense of unease, as though Theodore's image were more than mere paint and canvas. With a shudder, David realized the truth. This altar, this ritual room, was the heart of the curse. Theodore had imbued it with his own will, his own twisted desire to control and contain, even beyond death. "You found it," a voice echoed from the shadows, low and tainted with malice. David's flashlight flickered, and the air seemed to thicken as a spectral form took shape before him, coalescing into a figure he recognized from family portraits. Theodore Lockhart's spirit loomed over the altar, his eyes blazing with an unnatural light. David froze, his mind racing. You're Theodore." The apparition smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "Yes, and I see you've come to meddle in things you do not understand. You bound Isabel to this house, condemned her to a life of torment," David said, his voice trembling with anger. "You cursed your own bloodline for your greed, for your obsession with power." Theodore's laugh was a hollow, twisted sound that echoed around the chamber. Isabel was a distraction, a threat to the Lockhart legacy. Her death ensured the purity of our family's lineage, but her spirit was useful, a token, an offering to preserve our fortune and safeguard our future. He leaned closer, his face inches from David's, and David could feel a cold dread sink into his bones. "I did what was necessary, and so shall you." David clenched his fists, his anger overtaking his fear. "I'm here to end this, to release her, to break the curse. You won't control me, Theodore. I won't continue your twisted legacy." Theodore's spectral form sneered, his expression darkening. "You think you have a choice?" He gestured to the portrait, and suddenly, the room filled with a powerful surge of energy. The walls seemed to close in, and David felt his own will weakening, a cold force tightening around his mind, urging him to submit, to kneel before the altar. Images flooded his vision, visions of generations of Lockharts standing before Theodore's altar, each one swearing loyalty to his vision, pledging their lives to his relentless ambition. He saw Edward, his great-uncle, kneeling before the altar with haunted eyes, too weak to resist Theodore's influence, too bound by the curse to defy him. David felt himself slipping, drawn to the same dark allegiance. But then, a different image broke through. A memory of Isabel, her eyes filled with sorrow, her spirit pleading with him to set her free, to end the cycle of suffering that Theodore had begun. Her words echoed in his mind. "You must leave before you become what they made me." David's will surged, and he tore his gaze away from the portrait. "No," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "I'm not yours to command, Theodore. This ends now." With a roar of defiance, David raised the locket, clutching it tightly. The pendant seemed to vibrate with a warm energy, one that pushed back against the chill of Theodore's influence. As he held it aloft, a wave of light emanated from it, filling the chamber with a golden glow that clashed with the dark energy surrounding the altar. Theodore's form wavered, his expression twisting in fury. "You cannot break my will," he snarled. "I am bound to this place, to every descendant who dares to bear my name. The curse will continue as long as a Lockhart lives." "Then consider this my final act as a Lockhart," David replied, his voice steady. "I reject your legacy. I renounce your power. I free Isabel, and I free myself." With those words, he threw the locket onto the altar, the golden light intensifying as it struck the stone. The air vibrated, the symbols on the walls flaring with a fiery glow before disintegrating, the ancient binding sigils cracking and breaking. Theodore's form flickered, his anger turning to desperation as he reached out, his voice a shriek that echoed through the chamber. "No, you will not defy me. I am the Lockhart legacy. I am eternal." But his words were lost as the light from the locket exploded outward, engulfing the chamber in a blinding, purifying radiance. The altar cracked, crumbling to pieces, and Theodore's form dissolved, his anguished scream fading into silence. The walls began to shudder, the dark energy lifting as the curse unraveled, its power broken at last. When the light subsided, David found himself kneeling on the floor, the remnants of the altar scattered around him, the air clear and still. He could feel a weight lifting from his heart, a sense of peace settling over him that he had never known in this house. Isabel was free. The curse was broken. He rose, the silence around him now filled with a strange serenity. He turned to leave the chamber, feeling as though the mansion itself had been transformed. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a quiet warmth, as though the house had been waiting for this release for generations. As he climbed the stairs back to the main floor, he thought of Isabel, of Edward, and of all the Lockharts who had suffered under Theodore's curse. He hoped that, wherever they were, they too had found peace. Back in the main hall, the morning sun was streaming through the windows, filling the mansion with light. The air was fresh, the shadows no longer clinging to the corners. David took a deep breath, feeling as though he were breathing freely for the first time since he had set foot in the house. He paused, looking back up at the grand staircase, at the house that had harbored so much darkness for so long. "It's over," he murmured. "It's finally over." That afternoon, as David prepared to leave the mansion, he received a call from Dr. Monroe. She sounded relieved, her voice lighter than he had ever heard it. "I felt it," she said. "The curse, it's gone, isn't it?" "Yes," David replied, a faint smile on his face. "Isabel and the others, they're free now. Theodore's hold over the family has finally ended." Dr. Monroe sighed. "You've done a great thing, David. I'm sure Isabel and your ancestors will be at peace now, thanks to you." They said their goodbyes, and David turned toward the mansion one last time. It was no longer a place of shadows and suffering. He decided to honor Isabel's memory, to restore the mansion not as a monument to the Lockhart legacy, but as a place of healing, a way to turn the house's dark past into something new, something good. As he walked down the driveway, he felt a gentle breeze brush past him, carrying with it the faintest scent of lavender. He smiled, knowing it was Isabel, a final goodbye from the spirit he had freed. The Lockhart legacy was no more, but from its ashes, David would build something worthy of remembrance. Something that would stand as a testament to redemption, to freedom, and to love unbound by curses. Several weeks had passed since David had left Lockhart Mansion, leaving behind the weight of its curse and the legacy that had bound his ancestors. In the light of his newfound freedom, he focused on plans to restore the mansion as a historical site, turning it into a place where the pain and darkness of the past could be transformed into a story of redemption and resilience. Yet, even as he distanced himself physically from the mansion, he found himself plagued by strange dreams. In these dreams, he would wander through the mansion's empty halls, hearing faint whispers and footsteps just beyond his sight. At first, he dismissed these visions as residual effects of his experience, the lingering remnants of his time in the haunted house. But as the dreams grew more intense, David sensed a new urgency behind them, as though they were trying to show him something he had missed. One night, in the throes of another unsettling dream, he found himself back in the hidden chamber beneath the mansion, facing the shattered remnants of Theodore's altar. But this time, instead of a cold silence, he heard a distinct voice, a woman's voice, soft yet insistent. "David, you have freed me, but the curse is deeper still." He spun around, searching for the source of the voice. In the darkness, he saw a figure, Isabel, her form faint and ethereal, yet her expression filled with urgency. "Theodore's curse runs deeper than this house. He bound it to the Lockhart name, to every descendant. You have only delayed its grasp, unless you find the true source." David's heart pounded as he stared at her, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. "What do you mean? I destroyed the altar, broke the bindings. Isn't that enough?" She shook her head, her sorrowful gaze piercing him. "The altar was merely a vessel. Theodore ensured his curse would pass down through blood. Only one who renounces the Lockhart name and purges its tainted bloodline will end it." As her words sank in, David's surroundings blurred, and he woke in his own bed, drenched in sweat. Isabel's warning echoed in his mind, leaving him with a sinking realization. Despite everything he had done, the curse still lingered, rooted in his family's blood. The next morning, David met again with Dr. Monroe, who had become a confidant and ally in his mission to rid himself of the Lockhart curse. They sat in her study, surrounded by ancient texts and relics from the town's history, as he recounted his dream and Isabel's warning. Dr. Monroe listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. "If Isabel is correct, then Theodore's curse is more insidious than we imagined," she murmured. "If he bound the curse to the Lockhart bloodline itself, then destroying the altar would have only severed his direct influence over the mansion." David looked at her, the weight of his realization dawning. "But if the curse is connected to the bloodline, that means every descendant, including me, is still at risk. She nodded solemnly. Yes, Theodore's influence could manifest in subtle ways. Failed relationships, tragic accidents, mental anguish. It's not a visible curse, but a shadow that lingers, weakening each Lockhart over generations. David clenched his fists, anger simmering in his chest. Theodore's cruelty had extended far beyond Isabel's suffering. He had condemned his entire family to lives tainted by his ambition. He couldn't allow it to continue. Is there a way to cleanse the bloodline? He asked, desperation in his voice. Dr. Monroe hesitated, her eyes shifting to a dusty old tome on her desk. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the faded pages until she found a passage written in Latin. Translating it aloud, she read, "A blood curse, to be undone, must be severed at its root. Only the blood of the one who cast it can dispel its hold." David's heart sank. Theodore is long dead. How am I supposed to find his blood? Dr. Monroe's gaze sharpened. Not all of his blood is gone, David. You are his descendant, carrying his blood through your veins. By renouncing your ties to him, to the Lockhart name, you may be able to disrupt the curse. It would be an intense ritual, requiring complete detachment from your lineage. And even then, we'd need an anchor for the ritual, something that belonged to Theodore, something infused with his essence. David thought back to the items he had found in the attic, in the hidden rooms beneath the mansion, and then it struck him. The portrait, the one he had seen on the altar, the image of Theodore's piercing gaze that seemed to capture his soul. That portrait was a part of him, as tied to the curse as he was. It's still at the mansion, David said. The portrait. We can use that. Dr. Monroe's eyes glinted with determination. Then we need to perform the ritual there. The mansion is the curse's origin and holds residual energy from Theodore's dark magic. With the portrait as our anchor, and your blood as the final severance, we may be able to end it. They made plans to meet at the mansion that evening. David felt the weight of his family's history bearing down on him as he left, knowing that this final confrontation would demand all his resolve. By dusk, David and Dr. Monroe had gathered in the foyer of Lockhart Mansion. The house seemed quieter, almost expectant, as though it knew its fate would soon be sealed. They made their way to the hidden chamber beneath the mansion, each step echoing through the silent halls. The shattered altar lay before them, and beside it rested the portrait of Theodore, his cold gaze still defiant, as though challenging them to break the bonds he had forged. Dr. Monroe placed candles around the altar, lighting them carefully, their flickering light casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Dr. Monroe instructed David to kneel before the altar, the portrait facing him. She began the ritual, reciting words from the ancient text, her voice resonant and steady as she invoked the severance of blood, the breaking of bonds. "David Lockhart, you stand here as the last of your line," she intoned. "Renounce the name, renounce the blood, and break free of the curse bound to your veins." David gripped the edge of the altar, his heart pounding. "I renounce the name of Lockhart," he said, his voice strong. "I renounce the legacy of Theodore. I sever my ties to his blood and his curse." Dr. Monroe nodded and handed him a small, ceremonial dagger. "Now, your blood must flow for the ritual to hold. A single drop on the portrait will be enough." He took the dagger, hesitating only a moment before pricking his finger. He watched as a single droplet of blood gathered at the tip, glistening in the candlelight, then let it fall onto the portrait of Theodore. The moment his blood touched the canvas, a powerful shockwave pulsed through the room, extinguishing the candles. The darkness around them deepened, and the ground trembled as an unearthly wail filled the chamber. The air grew frigid, and David felt a malevolent presence descend upon him, Theodore's spirit lashing out in one final act of defiance. "You dare defy me?" Theodore's voice snarled, reverberating from the walls. "You are mine, bound to my bloodline. You cannot escape me, David." Dr. Monroe continued chanting, her voice unwavering, calling upon ancient forces to counter Theodore's hold. The ritual had created a protective barrier, weakening his spirit's grasp. But David could feel Theodore's fury, his essence clinging to him, refusing to let go. "I renounce you, Theodore." David shouted into the darkness. "You have no power over me. I reject your curse, your legacy, and everything you stood for." As his words rang out, the portrait began to smolder, a faint red glow spreading from where his blood had landed. Theodore's face contorted in pain, his gaze twisting from defiance to rage, and finally to desperation as he realized his hold was slipping. "No." Theodore's voice was a guttural scream, filled with centuries of malice and desperation. "You will pay for this. You and every one of my descendants will." But his words were cut off as the portrait burst into flames, the fire consuming his image and filling the room with a blinding, purifying light. David shielded his eyes, feeling the heat as the flames devoured the last remnants of Theodore's spirit. When the fire finally subsided, the room was silent, the oppressive darkness lifted. Dr. Monroe placed a reassuring hand on David's shoulder, her eyes filled with relief. "It's over," she whispered. "The curse is broken." David felt a strange lightness within him, a weight he hadn't realized he'd carried finally lifted. The air around them was clear, free of the malevolent presence that had plagued his family for generations. The Lockhart name, once bound to Theodore's twisted ambition, was now free from his grasp. In the weeks that followed, David began transforming the mansion, restoring it not as a tribute to the Lockhart legacy, but as a testament to freedom, healing, and new beginnings. With Isabel freed and the curse broken, he could finally see the mansion as a place of potential, a space for others to find peace instead of suffering. One evening, as he stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds, he felt a familiar, gentle breeze. The scent of lavender filled the air, and he felt a warmth on his shoulder, as if someone were standing beside him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Isabel. Her presence was peaceful, no longer bound by anguish or sorrow. In his heart, he knew that she had finally found the rest she deserved, free from the torment that Theodore had cast upon her. "Thank you, David." Her voice seemed to whisper on the wind, soft and filled with gratitude. He closed his eyes, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Isabel's spirit, once trapped and tormented, was now free, just as he was. In freeing her, he had also freed himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mansion in a golden glow, David felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had spent so much of his life focused on his career, on wealth and success, but this experience had shifted something within him. The Lockhart legacy had once been a burden, but now it felt like a path to purpose, a chance to honor those who had suffered, to turn his family's dark history into something meaningful. Months later, the mansion opened to the public as a historical site and cultural center. People from all over visited, captivated by its beauty and haunted past. Local artists displayed their works in the Grand Hall, musicians played in the ballroom, and historians held talks about the town's history. Where shadows had once lingered, light now filled every room. On the day of the grand opening, David stood before a portrait he had commissioned, a rendering of Isabel, her face serene and her gaze soft, looking out toward the new life the mansion held. The portrait hung in the main hall, a tribute to her memory and a reminder of the journey he had taken to break his family's curse. Dr. Monroe joined him, admiring the painting with a soft smile. "She looks at peace," she said quietly. David nodded, a calm satisfaction in his heart. "She is. They all are." The mansion finally has the purpose it deserved. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as visitors explored the rooms and corridors that had once held the weight of the Lockhart family's dark secrets. Now, these halls echoed not with sorrow but with laughter, music, and the vibrant hum of life. The curse was broken, the mansion's past laid to rest, and in its place, a new legacy had begun. David had found more than just peace in the process. He had found purpose, a new legacy unburdened by the past, and in doing so, had transformed the mansion and himself into something beautiful. Weeks passed, and Lockhart Mansion became a beacon in the community, its history drawing visitors and locals alike. David, now free of the haunting presence of his ancestors' curse, finally felt a sense of pride in the mansion. He'd begun to embrace his role as its custodian, organizing events and exhibitions to honor its history. Each day, The mansion felt brighter, its dark legacy fading as new memories replaced the old. One chilly autumn morning, as David was preparing for a historical tour, he noticed a stranger standing just outside the mansion's grand entrance. The man wore a well-tailored coat, his posture straight and poised, but his expression was hard to read. A strange blend of curiosity and detachment. His gaze lingered on the mansion as though he were trying to see beyond its walls. David approached, a welcoming smile on his face. "Good morning. Are you here for the tour?" The man's gaze shifted to David, his eyes sharp and unsettlingly familiar, though David couldn't quite place where he'd seen them before. "No, I'm here to see you, Mr. Lockhart," he replied smoothly. "My name is Samuel Reeves. I'm a distant relative, you could say." David's smile faded, replaced by a wary curiosity. "A relative? I thought I was the last of the Lockhart line." Samuel's lips curved into a faint smile. "Technically, yes. But our family histories are tied in more ways than bloodlines alone." He paused, casting a look over the mansion with an almost reverent air. "I'm here to talk about the curse." David's heart skipped a beat. He had thought the curse was behind him, the weight of Theodore's dark legacy lifted. Yet, here stood a man claiming kinship through a connection even he didn't understand. Samuel met David's gaze with an intensity that made the autumn air feel colder. "I know you believe the curse is broken, and in many ways it is. But there are lingering echoes, remnants, if you will." Theodore's influence was woven into the mansion's very foundation. David's mind raced, remembering Isabel's final words to him about the curse being deeper than he knew. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his tone. "I went to great lengths to end the curse. The ritual destroyed Theodore's altar, and his spirit was finally laid to rest." Samuel's expression softened, almost pitying. "Yes, the altar was destroyed, and Theodore's spirit was weakened. But certain marks remain, Mr. Lockhart. Theodore's ties to this place are resilient. You might think of it as a shadow left by his soul, lingering here, bound to anyone bearing the Lockhart name." David's pulse quickened, a chill settling over him as he considered Samuel's words. He had felt a sense of freedom, yet he had also noticed small disturbances around the mansion. The faint creaking of the attic floorboards, cold drafts in rooms that were sealed off, and even the occasional flickering of lights. He had dismissed these as natural quirks of an old house, but now they took on a more ominous tone. "What are you suggesting?" David asked, his voice steady but wary. Samuel took a step closer, his voice low and serious. "I'm suggesting that Theodore's influence may never truly be erased without destroying the mansion entirely. His presence is woven into every stone and beam, sustained by the suffering and sacrifices of the past." David's heart clenched. The mansion had become a place of purpose, transformed into a positive force in the community. The thought of tearing it down felt like erasing all that he and Isabel had suffered to redeem it. "There must be another way. I won't destroy it. Not after everything that's been done to give it a new beginning." Samuel sighed, almost as if he had expected this answer. "There may be one last option," he admitted, his tone hesitant. "A final ritual. But it's dangerous, and it requires something only you, as a Lockhart, can give." David's mind raced with questions. He had thought he had given enough. His blood, his will, his very identity as a Lockhart. But now it seemed that the mansion's hold on him would not be relinquished so easily. "What does this ritual entail?" he asked, feeling a creeping dread but also a fierce determination to end this once and for all. Samuel pulled a worn, leather-bound book from his coat pocket and handed it to David. Its cover bore symbols David recognized from his time in the hidden chamber, markings tied to ancient rituals and protection spells. Samuel opened it to a page filled with elaborate diagrams and Latin inscriptions. "The ritual is called Ultimum Sacramentum," Samuel explained. "It's a severance of spirit and place, a cutting of the spiritual ties that Theodore embedded in this mansion. But it demands a great deal from the person performing it. Your will alone will determine its success or failure." David scanned the text, his Latin rusty, but enough to understand that this was indeed a powerful spell. The ritual required an intense focus, a complete renunciation of Theodore's influence, and an offering of something deeply personal. It described a fire, a purifying flame meant to consume the remnants of Theodore's presence and sever his connection to the house forever. "And if I fail?" David asked quietly. Samuel met his gaze, his face grave. Then Theodore's presence could re-emerge, stronger than before. And this time, he won't let go so easily. David felt a surge of determination. He had come too far to let Theodore's shadow linger over his life. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. Samuel nodded approvingly. "Then we should begin tonight, at midnight. That's when the mansion's energy is at its most potent. I'll be here to guide you through the ritual." That night, as the clock neared midnight, David prepared for the final ritual. He wore simple clothing and carried only the book and a candle, his mind focused on the task ahead. Samuel waited for him in the mansion's main hall, his expression calm but watchful. They made their way to the attic, the place where Theodore's influence had been strongest. David felt the old, familiar unease creeping over him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had chosen to face this, and he would see it through. Samuel arranged a circle of protective salt around David, lighting candles at each point of the circle. "Once we begin, you must not leave this circle," Samuel warned. "The ritual will draw out the residual energy of the mansion, but it will also attract the remnants of Theodore's spirit. The salt will keep you protected, as long as you stay within it." David nodded, his heart pounding as he knelt within the circle. Samuel began to chant, his voice deep and rhythmic, calling upon ancient forces to sever the bonds tying Theodore's essence to the mansion. As the chant grew louder, David felt a strange warmth radiate through the floor beneath him. The air grew dense, pressing against him with a force that felt almost physical. Shadows gathered at the edges of the attic, swirling and coalescing into dark, twisted forms. Theodore's voice echoed through the room, low and filled with malice. "You dare attempt to break my will? Foolish boy, you are nothing without the Lockhart name." David clenched his fists, focusing on Samuel's chant, letting its cadence ground him. "I reject you, Theodore," he said, his voice strong. "You have no power over me. I choose my own path, free from your curse." The shadows around him writhed, Theodore's face emerging within them, twisted with rage. "You are mine, David. You cannot defy what is in your blood." Summoning his strength, David reached deep within himself, drawing upon his desire for freedom, for peace, for Isabel, who had been tormented for too long. He could feel his own will pushing back against Theodore's influence, the warmth within him growing stronger, filling him with a fierce resolve. The attic began to shake, the walls seeming to breathe with an unnatural pulse. Theodore's face twisted in agony, his form flickering as David's defiance grew. The warmth within him turned to a white-hot flame, a purifying fire that surged through his body, pushing against the darkness with all the force he could muster. "I am not yours, Theodore," David shouted, his voice echoing through the attic. "I break your hold on this house and on my blood. You have no place here anymore." With a final roar, Theodore's form shattered, dissolving into wisps of shadow that faded into the air. The oppressive presence lifted, leaving the attic still and silent. The warmth within David faded, replaced by a profound calm, a peace he had never felt before. Samuel extinguished the candles, a satisfied smile on his face. "It's done," he said quietly. "Theodore's presence is finally gone." David stood, feeling lighter, as though a weight he hadn't fully understood had been lifted. The mansion no longer felt haunted. It felt like a place of hope, a place finally free of the Lockhart curse. As they descended the stairs, David looked back at the attic, a soft smile touching his lips. Isabel was free. He was free. And at long last, the mansion was just a house, a beautiful, storied house that he could now call home. Over the following days, the mansion seemed transformed. Its rooms were bathed in natural light, and the lingering heaviness that had once clung to every wall and corner was now gone. Visitors sensed the change, drawn to its new energy and the warm welcome that David had worked so hard to create. For the first time, he felt at peace, free from the family curse and his ancestors' dark legacy. But just as he began to feel a sense of closure, a letter arrived on his doorstep, hand-delivered in an old-fashioned envelope. The paper was thick and yellowed, and his name was scrawled across it in elegant handwriting. Inside was a short, cryptic note. The house may be free, but the past still has stories left to tell. I will come at dusk. Be prepared to learn what remains hidden. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. David's first thought was of Samuel, but the handwriting was different, too delicate and refined. A strange unease crept over him. The mansion had been liberated from Theodore's influence, and yet, someone else appeared to have unfinished business with him. He resolved to wait, his curiosity mingling with caution. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mansion in shades of amber and shadow, a figure appeared at the gate. She was an elderly woman, her posture proud despite her age, her eyes sharp and bright as they took in the sight of the mansion. She wore a deep burgundy shawl and carried a leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges. David met her at the front door, his curiosity plain on his face. "Good evening. I'm David Lockhart. I assume you're the one who sent the letter?" The woman inclined her head slightly. "Yes, I am. My name is Eleanor Hawthorne, and I'm here on behalf of my family. Like Isabel, I am one of the Hawthornes." David's heart skipped a beat. Isabel's family had remained in the town for generations, but he had assumed their connection to the mansion had faded after her tragic end. To see a Hawthorne standing here, ready to confront the Lockhart legacy, was both unexpected and deeply unsettling. "Please, come in," he said, gesturing toward the main hall. They sat in the parlor, and David offered her a cup of tea, which she accepted with a gracious nod. She placed her notebook on the table between them, her gaze steady and assessing. Eleanor studied him carefully. "You've done a remarkable thing here, David. I can feel that Theodore's curse is no longer tethered to the mansion. Isabel's spirit has finally been freed. But there's one last truth I came to reveal, one that I believe you have the right to know." David leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What truth?" Eleanor opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with letters, sketches, and faded photographs. At the center was a carefully preserved letter written in the familiar, elegant handwriting of Edward Lockhart. She held it out to him, her hand steady despite the years. "This letter was passed down through the women of our family, each one holding it until we could find the rightful Lockhart to share it with," she explained. "It was written by Edward after Isabel's death. It holds secrets your great-uncle couldn't bring himself to tell you when you released her spirit." David accepted the letter with reverence, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the paper. He began to read, Edward's words flowing over him with the weight of a long-buried confession. "My dearest descendant, if you are reading this, it means you are the one who chose to face the sins of our family. Know that you have my deepest gratitude, and that you have freed the spirit of the woman I loved, Isabel. But there is more you must understand, a truth I could not tell even to her, and one that has haunted me since her passing. The Lockhart name was bound not only to this house, but to a contract with forces beyond comprehension. Theodore was desperate to secure our family's fortune, to ensure we would rise above others and gain influence beyond our time. In his zeal, he invoked a spirit, a dark force that demanded not just sacrifice but loyalty through generations. Isabel was his first sacrifice, but she would not be the last. To seal the pact, Theodore bound the blood of every firstborn child in the family to this force. The curse would end only if one Lockhart willingly defied this pact, choosing love and freedom over power. This curse has haunted us, and I was too weak to break it. You are my last hope, dear descendant. If you are reading this, you have already broken Theodore's immediate hold. But you must take care. The true spirit bound to the family, the one Theodore called forth, is still tied to our bloodline. Only by turning away from the Lockhart fortune entirely, by dedicating this mansion to something greater than ourselves, can you end it for good." David's hand shook as he read Edward's words. The curse had been deeper, more sinister than he had ever imagined. Theodore's ambition had extended beyond Isabel's suffering. He had sealed the Lockhart family's bloodline to a malevolent force that demanded loyalty through each generation's eldest child. He looked up at Eleanor, his mind reeling. "You knew this?" Eleanor nodded solemnly. "My family has watched the Lockharts suffer under Theodore's greed for decades. We Hawthorns had our own hardships, our lives intertwined with the Lockharts in ways that brought both tragedy and strength. But when Isabel's spirit was freed, I knew the time had come to deliver Edward's final words." David took a deep, steadying breath. "Edward says I have to dedicate the mansion to something greater than ourselves. What could that mean?" Eleanor's gaze softened. "It means leaving behind the ambitions of the past. The Lockharts may have built their fortune on Theodore's dark pact, but you have the chance to rewrite the family legacy. Give this mansion to the town. Let it be a place for others to gather, to find inspiration, to make something meaningful. Turn it into a place of light rather than shadow." David's heart ached at the thought. The mansion had become a part of him, and he had envisioned it as his own legacy. Yet, deep down, he knew that Eleanor was right. This house held too much history, too much pain. To keep it as a personal monument would risk reigniting the curse Theodore had cast so long ago. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. "I'll do it. I'll dedicate the mansion to the town, create a foundation, something that everyone can share and benefit from. That way, the Lockhart name won't be tainted anymore. We'll be free." A small smile broke through Eleanor's serious expression. "You've made a wise choice, David. By doing this, you honor not only Isabel's memory, but all those who suffered under Theodore's influence." They spent the next few hours discussing plans for the mansion's future. David imagined it becoming an arts center, a community haven, a place where history could be preserved and celebrated without the darkness of his family's past. They talked well into the night, Eleanor's insights revealing a deeper knowledge of the Lockhart family than he'd ever known. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Eleanor rose to leave. She placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. "You've given the Lockhart name a chance to heal," she said, "and in doing so, you've brought peace to all who came before you." David watched her walk down the driveway, her figure fading into the morning mist until she was gone. He felt a profound sense of closure, a feeling he hadn't realized he was searching for. In the months that followed, David carried out his plans for the mansion with a renewed sense of purpose. He established a foundation to oversee its transformation, using his resources to restore it as a cultural center and community space. He dedicated rooms to local artists, created exhibits for the town's history, and opened the mansion's doors for gatherings, workshops, and performances. On the day of the mansion's grand reopening, David stood on the steps, watching as townsfolk and visitors wandered through the rooms that had once been filled with darkness and secrecy. Children laughed in the hallways, artists displayed their work in rooms where shadow had once lingered, and musicians played in the ballroom, their melodies filling the space with warmth and joy. Dr. Monroe approached him, her face beaming with pride. "You've done it, David. You've truly changed this place." David nodded, a sense of peace settling over him as he looked out over the crowd. "I think Theodore's influence has finally been erased. The mansion is free, and so am I." She squeezed his arm gently. "And with it, the town itself is freed from his legacy. You've created something beautiful here, David." As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the mansion, David took a quiet moment on the balcony overlooking the grounds. The breeze carried a familiar scent, lavender, faint but unmistakable. He smiled, feeling as though Isabel's spirit was there with him, a final blessing from the woman whose love and strength had broken the curse. The Lockhart name would continue, but now it would carry a legacy of hope, freedom, and redemption. And in the heart of the mansion, in every room filled with laughter and light, David knew that he had finally made peace with his family's past, turning the shadows into something worth remembering. The grand reopening of the mansion had left David with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't anticipated. He had finally given the Lockhart name a new beginning, turning a cursed legacy into a symbol of healing and resilience. The mansion thrived as a community hub, drawing people in from the town and beyond, each one contributing to its newfound spirit of light and inclusion. But as the weeks passed, small, unsettling incidents began to disturb the mansion's peace. At first, they were minor. A door left open that he was certain he had locked, a misplaced object, the faint sound of footsteps in empty hallways. David tried to dismiss them as quirks of an old house or the echo of past memories. But the disturbances grew more frequent, more insistent. Late one night, as David reviewed some documents in his study, he heard a soft thud from the grand staircase. It was followed by a slow, deliberate creaking, as though someone were descending step by step, each footfall measured and heavy. David's pulse quickened, and he rose to check the hall, expecting to find a late guest who had wandered out of their room. The hall, however, was empty. A chill washed over him as he scanned the staircase and the shadows pooling at the edges of the room. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to notice something he'd overlooked. He took a deep breath, calming his nerves. The curse was gone. Theodore's presence had been purged. There was nothing to fear here. Or so he thought. The next morning, David found a letter slipped under his door, written on the same aged, yellowed paper as the one he had received weeks earlier from Eleanor Hawthorne. Only this time, the handwriting was different, sharp and jagged. The note contained just a few cryptic words. The house is free, but the truth is not. You have only scratched the surface. A chill ran down his spine. The note implied that his family's dark history was not fully laid to rest, that despite everything he had done, there were secrets left uncovered. He decided to consult Dr. Monroe, whose knowledge of the Lockhart family history had proven invaluable in the past. Dr. Monroe welcomed him with a kind but curious smile. As they settled into her study, David explained the recent disturbances and showed her the cryptic note. She studied it carefully, her brow furrowing as she considered its meaning. "It's possible," she said, her voice measured, "that the physical curse tied to Theodore's presence was lifted, but there are remnants, unfinished stories and lingering spirits tied to the events that took place in that house. It wouldn't surprise me if they're making themselves known now that the mansion is filled with life again." David nodded slowly, his mind racing with questions. "You're saying there could be other spirits? Other fragments of the past that remain?" She gave a slight nod. "Not all spirits are bound by curses. Some are tethered to unresolved emotions, to moments in time that were too powerful or tragic to fade. And considering the violent and tragic past of the Lockhart family, it's possible some of those stories have yet to reach their conclusion." David felt a pang of unease. He had thought he'd finally found peace, that he could move forward without any more confrontations with the past. But the note had made one thing clear. Someone or something wanted him to uncover the mansion's remaining secrets. Determined to put his doubts to rest, David began a meticulous search through the mansion, scouring every room, every corner, for anything he might have missed. He combed through the attic, the basement, and the hidden chambers where he had first confronted Theodore's presence. Yet nothing seemed out of place. Nothing gave any indication of unfinished business. He was beginning to think the note was simply an attempt to unnerve him. Then, one night, as he wandered through the library, he noticed something odd. A single book lay open on the table, a family journal dating back over a century, its pages yellowed and delicate. He didn't remember placing it there, but curiosity got the better of him. He scanned the pages, noting the familiar names of ancestors and their detailed accounts of life in the mansion. Near the end of the journal, he came across an entry dated November 14, 1891. The handwriting was frantic, as though the writer had been in a hurry or in distress. His great-grandfather, Arthur Lockhart, had written it. "I fear I have made a grave mistake," the entry read. "There are forces at work here that I do not understand. Theodore's pact was never fully disclosed to us, and now we are paying the price." He spoke of a guardian, a spirit bound not by Theodore but by something older, something tied to the land itself. "I've tried to suppress it, to lock it away, but I feel its presence every night, lurking, waiting. I am afraid it will never leave." David felt his blood run cold. A guardian spirit? He remembered Eleanor's words, that his family's fortune had been built upon more than just Theodore's dark pact. It seemed that Theodore had not only bound the mansion to his influence, but had awakened something far older, something tied to the very foundations of the mansion. The journal continued, though the handwriting became shakier, almost illegible. If anyone finds this, know that Theodore was not the origin. There is a deeper power here, one that will remain unless it is acknowledged. The Lockharts were merely vessels. David shut the journal, his mind racing. Theodore's influence had overshadowed his family's history, but it appeared he had only been a piece of a much older mystery. The land upon which the mansion stood held secrets that stretched back beyond the Lockhart name. Secrets that even Theodore had sought to control but never truly understood. He had thought Theodore's malevolent spirit was the end of the mansion's haunting. But now it was clear there was more. An entity that predated his family's arrival, something tied to the land itself. And if Arthur's words were true, it was a force that had yet to be reckoned with. As the days passed, the disturbances in the mansion grew more pronounced. The flickering lights, the footsteps in empty rooms, even whispers in the dead of night. They all took on a new, ominous tone, as though something were testing his resolve. David began to feel as if he were being watched, the presence both subtle and powerful, always lurking just beyond his perception. Finally, desperate for answers, he sought out Eleanor Hawthorne once more, hoping she might have insights into this newly uncovered guardian spirit. She listened quietly as he recounted what he had found in Arthur's journal, her face growing serious. "There are old legends," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "Stories from long before the Lockharts claimed that land. Some say the mansion stands on ground once considered sacred by those who lived here centuries ago. It was said to be a place of powerful spirits, guardians of the land who protected it from those who would exploit it." David's mind spun as he processed her words. So Theodore didn't create this curse. He merely disturbed something that was already here? Eleanor nodded, her expression grave. Yes, Theodore's pact may have drawn out this spirit's anger, bound it to the mansion and to the family. His selfish ambition awakened a force he couldn't control. And now that you've released the curse, the spirit may be trying to reassert its own claim. David's pulse quickened, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Is there any way to appease it? To restore peace? Eleanor hesitated before responding. The legends say that spirits tied to the land must be honored, their sanctity acknowledged. You may have to perform a ritual of atonement, offering something of yourself to show that the Lockhart presence here is no longer one of exploitation, but one of respect and understanding. The weight of her words sank into him. He had only just completed one ritual to free his family's past, yet now he faced another, a reckoning not just with Theodore, but with the very land beneath the mansion. If he failed, he risked losing everything he had worked so hard to restore. That evening, David returned to the mansion with renewed purpose, determined to atone for the sins of his ancestors. He gathered items that represented the new legacy he was building. A piece of art from a local artist, a book on the town's history, and a photograph of the mansion filled with life and laughter. He set them on a small altar in the backyard, beneath an ancient oak tree that he sensed held the spirit's attention. As the moon rose, he spoke aloud, his voice steady but humble. To the guardian of this land, I offer these symbols of change, of respect. The Lockharts may have claimed this mansion, but they never truly understood what you are, or the power you hold. I am here to honor you, to make peace with the land and the history upon which this house stands. A cold wind stirred, brushing against his skin as though acknowledging his words. He felt a presence, ancient and powerful, observing him, weighing his sincerity. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows around him deepening, and for a moment he wondered if he had made a grave mistake. But then, the wind softened, and a feeling of warmth and peace washed over him, as though the spirit had accepted his offering. The lights in the mansion flickered once, then returned to their steady glow. The presence that had lingered, watching him, seemed to dissolve, leaving a profound silence that felt almost reverent. David exhaled, a deep sense of relief filling him. He had made his peace, not just with the mansion and his family's history, but with the land itself. For the first time, he felt truly at home, bound not by a curse, but by a newfound respect and understanding for the place he had reclaimed. The Lockhart mansion, once a site of darkness and betrayal, now stood as a place of harmony, its stories, both old and new, finally at rest. In the days following his ritual under the ancient oak tree, the mansion took on a warmth David hadn't thought possible. The air felt lighter, the hallways brighter, and a deep sense of peace seemed to radiate from its very walls. For the first time since he'd inherited it, David felt that Lockhart Mansion was finally free of the shadows of the past. Word of the mansion's transformation continued to spread, and people came from neighboring towns, curious to see the place where history, legend, and new beginnings intertwined. David, now fully embracing his role as the mansion's steward, welcomed each visitor, guiding them through its storied halls and sharing the tales of its former residents, both the dark ones and those that had led to redemption. On the day of the mansion's first community celebration, David found himself reflecting on all that had happened. He had faced his family's dark past, confronted a powerful curse, and finally made peace with the land's ancient spirit. But most importantly, he had freed himself, forging a new path not only for himself but for everyone touched by the Lockhart name. As evening descended, the celebration was in full swing. Musicians played soft, melodic tunes in the ballroom, filling the mansion with lively energy, and the grand hall was filled with laughter and conversation. Artists displayed their work, and local historians spoke of the mansion's restored significance to the town, recounting its stories with pride. Dr. Monroe arrived and joined him on the balcony overlooking the gardens, where lanterns cast a warm glow over the guests below. "You've done something incredible here, David," she said, smiling as she looked out over the crowd. "You've turned a haunted mansion into a symbol of hope and unity." David nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction. "I couldn't have done it alone. Everyone who believed in this place, who saw its potential, helped make this possible." He paused, looking out at the guests. "And I feel like Isabel and everyone else we lost along the way are finally at peace." Dr. Monroe placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's the beauty of history, David. It's never really gone. It just becomes part of something bigger, and in honoring the past, you've given it a future it never would have had otherwise." As they stood there in companionable silence, David felt a gentle breeze sweep through the balcony, carrying with it a faint, familiar scent of lavender. He smiled, a deep warmth settling in his heart. Isabel's presence was here, lingering in the laughter of the guests and the soft light of the lanterns, a blessing for the new legacy he was building. The celebration continued, and David moved through the rooms, speaking with guests, sharing stories, and taking in the joy that filled each space. The house, once cold and forbidding, now felt like a home, a place where life flourished and history could breathe without burden. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, David took one final walk through the mansion. The quiet halls echoed softly with the remnants of laughter and music, and he could feel the mansion's spirit humming with contentment. He stopped at the portrait of Isabel that hung in the main hall, her serene expression illuminated in the moonlight filtering through the windows. "Thank you, Isabel," he whispered, "for guiding me, for helping me understand what this place needed." He could almost imagine her smiling back at him, her spirit free from the chains that had once bound her. He walked upstairs to the attic, the place where his journey with the mansion had truly begun. Now, it was no longer filled with shadows. Instead, it felt calm and welcoming, like a space where memories could rest. He placed his hand on the door, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers. This room, once haunted and filled with sorrow, was now just another part of the house's history, a space of peace rather than pain. As he closed the attic door, he felt a profound sense of closure. Lockhart Mansion had found its new purpose, and so had he. No longer bound by the expectations of the past, he could live his own life, carrying forward the legacy he had shaped with his own hands. In the weeks and months that followed, the mansion continued to thrive, becoming a cherished part of the community. Schools held field trips there, artists found inspiration within its walls, and families gathered for celebrations, creating new memories and stories. Each visitor brought with them a little more life, a little more joy, transforming the mansion into a place of laughter and unity. And as David welcomed each person through its doors, he felt a connection not just to the mansion but to the community it had become a part of. Lockhart Mansion was no longer an isolated relic of a haunted past. It was alive, vibrant, a true reflection of the peace he had worked so hard to achieve. One sunny afternoon, as David tended to the gardens, he noticed a young girl standing by the ancient oak tree where he had performed the ritual of atonement. She was looking up at its branches with wide, curious eyes, her face lit with wonder. David walked over, kneeling beside her. "Do you like the tree?" he asked gently. She nodded, her gaze never leaving the tree's branches. "It feels special, like it's telling a story." David smiled, feeling a sense of contentment as he looked at the tree that had played such a crucial role in his journey. "It is special. It's part of this place's story, just like you are now." The girl looked at him, her eyes shining. "I want to know all the stories." David chuckled, feeling the weight of those words and the hope they carried. "Well, there are plenty to tell, and you're welcome to learn every one of them." As she ran back toward her family, David looked up at the oak tree, its branches stretching out toward the mansion, sheltering it in a quiet embrace. For the first time, he realized that his story, his family's story, had found its rightful place in the world, not as a haunted legacy but as a foundation for new beginnings. In the end, Lockhart Mansion became more than just a building. It was a place of healing, a testament to the power of transformation and the resilience of the human spirit. Through its walls echoed the laughter of children, the whispers of history, and the warmth of a community united by a shared past and a hopeful future. And at the heart of it all was David, who had taken his family's troubled legacy and, through courage, compassion, and determination, had turned it into something beautiful. The mansion, once a prison of dark secrets, now stood as a beacon of hope, welcoming all who entered with open arms and endless stories waiting to be told.